The dust had barely settled on her husband's grave when Olive Turner cracked the reins over her two horses and pointed her wagon west. And it was on that same gray morning that a stranger on a buckskin horse first appeared on the ridge behind her. The year was 1874, and the Kansas plains stretched out in every direction like a rumpled brown blanket thrown over the bones of the earth. The sky above was enormous and pale, the kind of sky that made a person feel both free and utterly alone at the same time. Olive felt both of those things simultaneously as she guided her wagon away from the small homestead she had shared with her late husband, Edmund Turner, for 3 years of a marriage that had been more practical than passionate, more duty than devotion. Edmund had died of fever 2 weeks prior, and the land they had worked together had never truly belonged to them, mortgaged so deeply to a bank in Abilene that there was nothing left to stay for once the bank's representative had come calling with his leather satchel full of papers and his practiced look of sympathy. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of a wagon, a team of 2 horses named Biscuit and Clover, a trunk of her belongings, a modest amount of provisions, and a letter from her sister in Colorado Territory. Her sister, Martha, had married a man named Gerald Holt who ran a successful dry goods store in a town called Creston, nestled in the foothills west of Denver. Martha had written that there was room for Olive, that Gerald was a fair man who would not begrudge a sister-in-law her keep, and that the town was growing fast enough that a capable woman could find her footing there. Olive had read the letter 4 times before Edmund passed, and she had made her decision before his breathing stopped entirely. She had loaded the wagon herself, tied it herself, hitched the horses herself, and rolled out of the yard of the homestead on a Tuesday morning in early April without looking back. There was nothing sentimental in her departure. She had grieved what she needed to grieve, and now there was only forward. She had not noticed the rider at first. The plains west of Abilene were well-traveled enough that a lone rider on a ridge was no remarkable sight. Cattle drives moved through periodically, and drovers and cowhands were as common as prairie grass. Olive kept her eyes on the trail ahead, the same wagon road that hundreds of settlers had worn into the earth over the previous decade, and she concentrated on keeping her horses at a steady pace. The morning was cool enough that she wore her heavy wool coat, the dark green one with the brass buttons that had been her mother's, and her dark hair was pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that kept the wind from her face. It was only after she had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours that she glanced back to check on the rope securing her trunk and noticed the rider. He was perhaps a quarter-mile behind her, on a buckskin horse, moving at precisely the same pace she was moving, not gaining on her, not falling behind, just following. Olive felt a prickle of unease move through her, but she told herself it meant nothing. People used the same roads. He was probably headed the same general direction she was and happened to be traveling at the same pace. She faced forward again and told herself not to be foolish. But an hour later, when she glanced back again, he was still there, and an hour after that, and another hour still. She began to pay closer attention. The rider kept a consistent distance, never pressing closer, never hanging back. He rode easy, with the relaxed posture of a man who had spent a great many years on horseback, his hat pulled low against the sun, which had broken through the clouds by midday and was now warming the plains into something almost pleasant. His horse was healthy and well kept from what she could see at that distance. He carried what appeared to be a rifle in a scabbard along the horse's flank, but he did not have the predatory energy of someone who meant her harm. He simply rode, steady and patient, keeping his distance. Olive stopped the wagon for her noon break, watering the horses from the barrel she had tied to the wagon's side. She ate a biscuit and some dried beef and watched the ridge where she had last seen the rider. He had stopped too, though farther back and off the road proper, sitting on his horse on a rise of land where she could see him against the sky but where he was clearly making no move to approach. She thought about it for a long time as she sat there eating her biscuit. He could be a threat. The Kansas plains in 1874 were not a place entirely without danger, and a woman traveling alone was well aware of the practical realities of her situation. There had been trouble with outlaws near Ellsworth the previous year, and her neighbor back at the homestead, old Mrs. Pratt, had warned her about taking the western road without a male escort. Olive had thanked Mrs. Pratt for her concern and done exactly as she planned regardless. But the rider behind her did not feel like a threat. He felt like a shadow, attentive and close, but not pressing. There was something in the way he held himself even at that distance that suggested a man more uncomfortable than aggressive. A man who was following her not because he wanted to take something from her, but because he was drawn to her in some way that he had not yet figured out how to explain. She decided not to stop and ask him his name. Not yet. She cracked the reins and moved on. The afternoon wore on into a landscape that shifted gradually from the open prairie she had known all her adult life into something that began to roll and undulate, the plains beginning to suggest the possibility of distant hills. Olive drove steadily, her mind working through the practical arithmetic of her journey. She had food for perhaps 10 days if she was careful. She had money enough to resupply at a trading post if she could find one. She had a rough map drawn by old Mr. Hartley from the general store in Abilene, who had made the journey to Colorado Territory himself some years prior, and had sketched out the landmarks and water sources with a hand that was more enthusiastic than accurate. She was thinking about water, in fact, calculating the distance to the creek that Mr. Hartley's map suggested she should reach by late afternoon, when the right front wheel of her wagon dropped into a rut in the road, and she heard a sound she absolutely did not want to hear. A crack, sharp and wooden, the sound of something giving way. She hauled back on the reins and brought the horses to a stop. She set the brake and climbed down from the wagon seat with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who was keeping herself calm by sheer force of will. She crouched down to look at the wheel. The spoke was cracked. One of the lower spokes, thick as it was, had taken the impact of the rut at just the wrong angle and had developed a fracture that ran from the hub outward through perhaps half its length. It had not failed yet, but it would. If she tried to drive on it for any significant distance over rough ground, it would give way entirely, and the wheel would collapse. And a collapsed wheel on the open plains was the kind of problem that could strand a person with very few good options. Olive straightened up and put her hands on her hips and looked at the horizon for a long moment. Then she looked back down the road. The rider was still there, perhaps 300 yards behind her, and now that she had stopped unexpectedly, she could see that he had also stopped and appeared to be watching her. She thought about it for less time than she expected. Then she raised her hand and waved him forward. There was a moment in which he did not move, and she wondered if perhaps she had misjudged the whole situation entirely and was about to feel very foolish. But then he started toward her, walking his horse at a calm pace, and as he drew closer she got her first real look at the man who had been following her for more than 4 hours. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she judged, lean and brown from the sun, with dark eyes that were steady and direct without being hard. He wore a working man's clothes, practical and worn but not ragged, with a canvas coat over a dark shirt and trousers tucked into well-used riding boots. He had a few days of dark stubble on his jaw and the kind of hands, she noticed as he drew his horse to a stop a polite distance away, that had done a great deal of physical work. His hat was the color of dust, broad-brimmed and shaped by 100 wearings into exactly the hat it needed to be. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Spoke broke," she said, because that seemed like the right place to start. He swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion and came forward, crouching down to look at the wheel without being invited to do so. He examined it with the serious attention of a man who understood what he was looking at, running his fingers along the crack, testing its depth. "Not all the way through," he said. His voice was low and even, but close enough. "I know," she said. He looked up at her from his crouch, and there was something in the exchange of that glance that was more direct than anything she had expected. He had light in his dark eyes, she noticed, the kind of light that came from intelligence and something else, something warmer. "I have a spare spoke," he said. "In my saddlebag. I could replace it if you allowed me." She blinked. "You carry wagon spokes in your saddlebag." "The one," he said. He stood up, and she realized he was taller than she had estimated from a distance. "I came across a woman with a broken-down wagon about a month back, about a half-day east of here. I couldn't fix it because I didn't have the right piece. She had 2 small children with her, and it took me 2 hours to ride to the nearest settlement and come back with help. I told myself after that I'd carry a spare spoke." He paused, and something flickered in his expression that might have been embarrassment. "I know it seems a peculiar thing to carry." "No," Olive said, and she was surprised to find that something in her had relaxed, a tension she had been holding all afternoon without entirely acknowledging it. "It seems like a very sensible thing to carry." He retrieved the spare spoke from his saddlebag. It was a close match, the same general dimensions, and with the tools he also carried, a hammer and a wagon wrench and a couple of other implements that he produced with the efficient ease of a man who had improvised in the field before. He set to work on the wheel while Olive held the horses' heads and watched. He worked quietly, without flourish, and did the job well. She could see that. He knew what he was doing, and he did not make a performance of it, which she appreciated. There were men who would have made a great deal of fuss about a small service rendered to a woman in order to make her feel obligated, and this man was not one of them. He simply worked. When he had finished, he wiped his hands on a cloth from his saddlebag and stood. "That should hold you," he said. "I'd advise going easy on rough ground for the next few days if you can. It's not as solid as the original was." "Thank you," she said. She paused, and then, because she had been wondering about it for the better part of a day and because the moment seemed to have finally arrived, she said, "You have been following my wagon since this morning." He looked at her steadily. "I have." 20 miles approximately. "About that, yes." She waited. He seemed to understand that she was waiting, and he had the honesty to look at least somewhat uncomfortable with the situation he had created. "I'm heading west," he said. "Same general direction. I don't mean any harm by it. I noticed you were traveling alone and He paused, and she saw him choose his words carefully. "I didn't want to crowd you by riding up, and I didn't want to leave you entirely unaccompanied on this road. There's been some trouble with a band of thieves working out of the draws west of here. 3 wagons robbed in the past 2 months. You could have introduced yourself this morning," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I should have. That was poor manners on my part, and I apologize for it." She studied him for a moment longer. He did not look away, but he also did not press her, did not try to fill the silence with justifications. She found that she valued that. "Your name," she said, "since I am only just now asking." Something shifted in his expression, something that was almost a smile. "Arthur Watkins." "Olive Turner," she said, and she did not offer her hand because she was thinking about something. "You said there have been 3 wagons robbed west of here." "Yes." "Did the people driving those wagons come to harm?" "One driver was roughed up badly. The others were shaken but physically unhurt." He paused. "The thieves took what they wanted and left. But I'd rather you not find out firsthand what they consider worth wanting." Olive considered this. She considered Arthur Watkins, this man who had followed her for 20 miles, who had fixed her wagon wheel with a spare spoke. He had specifically chosen to carry after a past encounter with a stranded family, who had apologized for not introducing himself with a directness and simplicity that she found, in spite of herself, rather disarming. "I am traveling to Creston, Colorado Territory," she said, "to my sister's family." "I know Creston," he said. "I've worked on a ranch outside of Denver for the past 3 seasons. I'm heading back there now." She looked at him for another long moment. The sun was getting lower, turning the plains a color that she had always thought of as the most beautiful thing about this country, that deep honeyed gold that made everything look like it was lit from within. "If you intend to continue following me," she said, "you may as well ride alongside instead." Now he did smile, and it changed his face considerably, opening it up, making him look younger and warmer and less composed. "I would appreciate that, ma'am." "Do not call me ma'am," she said. "It makes me feel like someone's grandmother. My name is Olive." "Olive," he said, and somehow the way he said it, carefully, like a word he was deciding to commit to memory, made her look away toward the horses so that he would not see whatever expression had crossed her face. They made camp that evening at the creek Mr. Hartley's map had promised, a modest waterway lined with cottonwood trees that were just beginning to show the first faint green of spring leaves. Arthur unsaddled his horse and picketed him near the creek while Olive unhitched her team, and they worked near each other in the comfortable practicality of two people who both knew how to make a camp. He built the fire. She cooked over it, a simple meal of salt pork and beans with cornbread baked in the Dutch oven she carried, and she made enough for two without being asked, because it seemed like the obvious thing to do. They ate across the fire from each other, and the conversation came in the way that conversations sometimes do between strangers who are not quite strangers anymore, carefully at first, and then less carefully. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, that his father had been a farmer and his mother a schoolteacher, that he had come west at 21 following a combination of restlessness and the kind of ambition that the East had not had room for. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas, had spent a year trapping in the mountains north of Denver before discovering that he liked the ranching life better, and had been with the Calder Ranch outside Denver for 3 seasons now, working as a cowhand with enough skill at breaking horses that the foreman, a man named Russ Calder, had told him that when the old handler retired he would have the job if he wanted it. "Do you want it?" she asked. He looked at the fire for a moment. "I think so," he said. "I like horses. They're honest. You always know where you stand with a horse, and you don't always know where you stand with people." He glanced up at her, and again there was that quality of directness in his gaze that she kept noticing. "No," he said, "not always." She told him about Edmund. She told it plainly, without excessive emotion, because that was how she dealt with things, and she watched him receive it the same way, with attention and without false sentiment. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Thank you," she said. "It was a marriage of practical arrangement, and I think we both knew it. He was a decent man. I am sorry he suffered at the end." There was a long pause in which the fire crackled, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a night bird called. "You are very direct," Arthur said, and it was not a criticism. "I find that pretending wastes everyone's time," she said. He looked at her steadily, and this time the smile that crossed his face was slower and quieter than the one earlier in the day, less surprised, more considered. "I think I agree with that entirely," he said. They slept on opposite sides of the fire that night, each in their own bedroll, with the proper distance that the situation required and that neither of them felt the need to comment on. Olive lay on her back and looked at the stars, which were extraordinary out here, the full spangled breadth of them visible in the absence of anything to diminish them, and she thought about the day that had just passed. She thought about a man carrying a spare wagon spoke because he could not stand the idea of another family being stranded with no help coming. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she said her name. She did not try to make sense of what she was feeling, because she was too tired and too sensible for that. She simply acknowledged that she felt it, whatever it was, and let herself fall asleep. The next morning he was up before her, and he had coffee made by the time she emerged from her bedroll, which she discovered was a quality she valued enormously in a traveling companion. They started west with the sun at their backs, Arthur riding alongside the wagon now, close enough to converse comfortably, and the day unfolded in a way that was, Olive thought privately, almost pleasurable. There was something to be said for having company on the open plains. The landscape, which had felt vast and indifferent when she was alone in it, felt somehow manageable with another presence beside her. He pointed out things she might have missed, practical things mostly. A good grazing spot for the horses where the grass was richer along a low depression, The remnants of a campfire that suggested recent traffic on the road ahead, the way certain clouds building to the southwest might mean weather by evening. He knew this country with the easy familiarity of someone who had ridden it many times, and she found herself listening to him with the attention she gave to people who actually knew what they were talking about, which was not something she gave indiscriminately. In the afternoon, they talked about Colorado Territory. He described Creston as he had known it 2 years prior when he had passed through, a proper town in the making, with a main street and several established businesses, a hotel, a newspaper, even a small church that the congregation was in the process of expanding. The Holt's dry goods store was there, he said, and he had purchased supplies from it himself once, though he did not remember meeting anyone named Holt with particular clarity. Gerald is not particularly memorable, Olive said, and then felt mildly guilty, though not guilty enough to take it back. Arthur laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh outright, and she had not expected it to do what it did to her expression, which was to produce a smile of its own entirely without her permission. "Is your sister happy?" he asked. Olive thought about it honestly. "I believe so. Martha has always been better at being content with things than I have. She finds goodness in a situation and settles into it. I've always been more direct," he offered. "I was going to say restless," she said. But perhaps those are the same thing. He considered that with the same seriousness he seemed to give to most things. "Maybe restlessness is just directness applied to the question of where you ought to be," he said. She looked at him. "That's surprisingly profound for a man on horseback." "I spend a great deal of time on horseback," he said. "A man has to think about something." The weather that had been building to the southwest did come in by evening, a proper plains thunderstorm that turned the sky an extraordinary green-gray and sent the wind gusting hard enough to rock the wagon. They had camped early in the lee of a low bluff that Arthur had identified as the best available shelter, and he helped her get the canvas cover on the wagon secured against the wind, while thunder rolled toward them across the flats with the sound of something enormous moving fast. The horses were nervous, and Olive was better with the team than she had expected to be. She talked to Biscuit and Clover in the same calm, steady tone she used when she meant to be heard without being alarming, and the horses settled somewhat, though they kept their ears back and their eyes wide. "You're good with horses," Arthur said, from where he was kneeling by his own picketed animal, one hand on the buckskin's neck. "I grew up with them," she said. "My father had a farm." "Where was that?" "Ohio," she said. "It feels like a very long time ago now." The rain came in sheets, and they sheltered him under the wagon and her inside it, which was awkward only in the theoretical sense, because in the practical sense they were both simply trying not to be soaked. Through the small gap in the wagon canvas she could see him out there in the rain, his hat pulled down, his coat dark with water, keeping watch over the camp with the patient alertness of someone who had weathered a great many storms and expected to weather a great many more. Something tightened in her chest that she did not entirely know what to do with. When the storm passed, the night air was cool and clean and smelled of wet earth and the particular freshness of rain on the plains, and they sat together at the rebuilt fire, both of them damp and steam-dried, and she made the coffee this time because she had the supplies in the wagon and he had built the fire, and that seemed like a fair division. "You don't sleep much," she observed. He looked up. "Excuse me. You were awake this morning before me. You were watching the camp through the storm." "I don't think you sleep much." He was quiet for a moment. "I sleep enough," he said. "I just sleep lightly." "Is there a reason for that?" He looked into the fire. There was something in his expression that was more complicated than his usual directness, a layer pulled back to reveal something older and less resolved beneath it. "I was in a situation a few years back," he said carefully, "where not sleeping lightly had consequences. I learned the habit and I haven't been able to shake it." She waited, because she had learned that he was a man who would say what he meant to say if given the space. "I was on a drive coming up from Texas," he said. "We had a man on night watch who wasn't paying attention. We lost 11 head of cattle to rustlers that night, and one of the other men, a fellow named Pete Caldwell, got a knock on the head that left him with trouble hearing ever after." He paused. "I've been the light sleeper since then." "That's honorable," she said. "It's practical," he said, but the way he said it suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the word honorable applied to himself, and she found that rather interesting. She decided not to pursue it further. She poured him more coffee, and he accepted it, and they sat in the comfortable quiet of the post-storm night, while the fire burned down and the stars came out one by one. The following morning they encountered the trading post marked on Mr. Hartley's map, a low-slung structure with a covered porch, and a somewhat optimistic sign that read General Supplies and Goods in large painted letters above the door. There were 2 other wagons already stopped there, and a group of men on horseback who Olive looked at with the brief, assessing attention of a woman traveling alone, and then dismissed as presenting no particular concern. The trading post proprietor was a woman, which was not what Olive had expected and which pleased her considerably. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered and entirely self-possessed, with gray-shot hair pinned back from a face that had seen a great deal of weather and appeared to have found all of it interesting rather than discouraging. Heading west, the woman asked as she tallied Olive's purchases of flour, dried beans, coffee, and a small portion of sugar. "Colorado Territory," Olive said. "Creston," the woman nodded. "Good town. My cousin lives there. She says it's growing." She glanced out through the open door to where Arthur was watering the horses at the trough outside. "Is that your husband?" Olive opened her mouth to say no, that he was merely a fellow traveler, and then something complicated passed through her and she said, "He is my companion," which was technically true and somehow felt more accurate than the alternative. The woman looked at her with the kind of look that understood more than the words. "Well, you're lucky to have one," she said simply, and handed Olive her change. They ate lunch at the trading post, at a table in the back of the store where the proprietor, whose name turned out to be Dorothea Crane, served a very good soup with bread, apparently on the principle that travelers needed feeding, and she was in a position to do the feeding. Dorothea kept to herself for most of the meal, but as they were finishing she leaned against the counter with her arms crossed and regarded them both with the comfortable frankness of a woman who had nothing left to be coy about. "How long have you 2 known each other?" she asked. "A day," Olive said. Dorothea looked at Arthur. Then she looked at Olive. Then she looked back at Arthur. "A day," she repeated, in a tone that communicated considerable volumes. "We met yesterday afternoon," Arthur said, with a gravity that was entirely undermined by the fact that he was clearly suppressing a smile. Dorothea made a sound that was equal parts skepticism and amusement. "Well," she said. "Long may it continue." They were back on the road by early afternoon, and the landscape had shifted again, the plains giving way more definitely now to something that suggested distance and depth, the far edge of the horizon beginning to hint at the blue-gray shapes that would eventually become mountains. Olive had never seen mountains in her life, and she found herself watching the horizon with an attention she could not entirely account for. "How far?" she asked. Arthur understood immediately what she meant. 3 more days, perhaps 4, depending on weather and the condition of the road. You'll start to see them clearly tomorrow, I think. Once you've seen them properly, you'll understand why people come west." "I thought people came west for land and opportunity," she said. "They come for those things too," he said. "But the mountains do something else entirely." He paused. "I can't describe it very well, you'll see." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon ahead with an expression that was open and almost young, stripped of the careful composure he generally maintained, and she found herself looking at him longer than she intended, and then looking away. That evening over the fire she asked him about the ranch, about the horses specifically, because she had understood that horses were the part of his life he was most fully himself within. He talked about horses for a solid hour. She could have stopped him. She did not stop him. She sat across the fire with her coffee growing cold in her hands, and listened to him talk about the particular intelligence of certain horses versus others, about the way a good horse learned to read its rider and match their mood, about the difference between breaking a horse and training one, and how a properly trained horse was a different animal entirely from one that had merely been beaten into submission. He talked about a mare at the Calder Ranch named Duchess who was, in his estimation, the most naturally gifted horse he had ever worked with, and his voice when he spoke about this animal had in it something that she recognized as love, the uncomplicated, certain love of a person for a thing they were meant to do. "You should train horses," she said when he paused. "That's what I'm hoping," he said. "Russ Calder's been patient enough with my ideas about training methods, but he's a traditional man and he wants results. I've been working on one of his younger stallions for 2 months, and the horse is doing well enough that I think Russ is coming around." "What is traditional about horses in this time?" she asked, curious. "Breaking them hard and fast," he said, his expression shifting into something that was not quite disapproval but was definitely conviction. "Spend a few days forcing a horse into submission through discomfort and repetition until they stop fighting. It works, but the horse never trusts you after that. You get an animal that will do what you ask, but that is always waiting for an opportunity not to. What I'm doing takes longer." "But the horse is different at the end of it. The horse chooses to work with you." "A horse that chooses," she said softly. "Yes," he said. And he looked at her across the fire, and the moment held itself still for a breath longer than conversation usually allowed, and she felt the color come into her face and was grateful for the firelight's ability to disguise such things. She asked about his family then, shifting the conversation deliberately. He told her about his father, a careful, methodical man who had loved farming in the way that some men love a quiet thing that demands everything from them without complaint. He had died when Arthur was 19, a heart that had apparently been working harder than anyone knew. His mother was still living in a town in Missouri called Harrisburg where she had returned after the farm was sold. She was teaching school still because she was the kind of woman who would teach school until the moment she did not. "You write to her?" Olive asked. "Every month," he said without any self-consciousness about it. "She writes back. Her letters are considerably more interesting than mine." "Why do you say that?" "Because she notices things," he said. "Small things about people and situations that most people miss. She'll write 3 pages about a single conversation she had at the post office and make it more entertaining than anything I've witnessed in a month." Olive laughed genuinely and heard herself do it, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and she watched Arthur hear it and watched something shift in his expression, something that made her look back at the fire. "You should laugh more," he said quietly. "I should do a great many things," she said, and meant it to sound wry, but it came out more honest than that. The next day brought the mountains. They appeared on the horizon in the early morning as the faintest suggestion of shape, something darker than the sky but not quite the same as Earth. And then gradually, as the hours passed and the miles fell away beneath the wagon wheels, they grew. They rose out of the land as if the earth were remembering something it had always known, building and building until they were unmistakably there, enormous and blue and covered with snow on their upper reaches, impossibly large and impossibly beautiful, and Olive found that she had stopped the wagon. She had not intended to stop. She had simply stopped. She sat on the wagon seat and looked at the mountains, and they were everything that Arthur had been unable to describe. He had stopped his horse beside the wagon without comment, and he watched her look at the mountains with an expression on his face that she did not see, because she was not looking at him. But if she had looked, she would have seen a man watching a woman see something beautiful for the first time, and the expression on his face in that moment was itself a kind of beautiful thing. "You were right," she said when she could speak. "I understand." "Yes," he said simply. She started the horses moving again. They rode in silence for a while, both of them in the presence of the mountains, and the silence was the kind that did not need to be filled. By mid-afternoon, the road had brought them through a stretch of country where the hills rose more steeply, and the trees began to appear in numbers, pine and spruce coming in along the higher ground, and the air had a different quality to it, thinner and cleaner and carrying with it the scent of resin and cold water. The town of Creston was less than a day's travel away now, Arthur said. They would make it by mid-morning tomorrow if the road held. Olive found that she was not in any particular hurry. She had been thinking about this for the past 2 days, building up an awareness of something that she was reluctant to put into direct words even in the privacy of her own thoughts, because she was a practical woman, and she knew that feelings built over 3 days of travel were not the same as the solid and tested foundations of a lasting thing. She knew this. She believed it. She also could not deny what she felt when Arthur Watkins looked at her across a fire, or when she heard him talk about horses with that open, unguarded love in his voice, or when she had woken in the night during the thunderstorm and seen him out there in the rain keeping watch over the camp, a man standing sentinel in a storm because it was the right thing to do. She could not deny it. She simply did not know what to do with it. That evening they camped for the last time on the road. Tomorrow Olive would be in Creston, at Martha's house, no longer in need of a traveling companion, and Arthur would ride on to the Calder ranch and his horses and his life, and they would part ways with polite well wishes and perhaps a handshake, and that would be the end of the whole remarkable, ordinary, extraordinary business of the past 3 days. She made dinner with more care than usual. She was not ready to examine why. He noticed. She was fairly sure he noticed, because he was the kind of man who noticed things, who had carried a spare wagon spoke in his saddlebag for an emergency he simply decided to be ready for. And he sat across the fire and ate the meal she had made and looked at her steadily and said nothing that needed to be said, which was somehow the most eloquent thing he could have done. After dinner he got up and came around the fire, not pressing, not assuming, and crouched down a few feet from where she sat and said, "Olive." She looked at him. "I would like to call on you in Creston," he said. "When I come into town, which Russ Calder allows his men to do on the last Saturday of each month. If you would allow it." She looked at him for a long time. He did not rush her. "It's a small town," she said. "People will talk." "I imagine so," he said. "I'm a recent widow. I know that. I have no intentions of being courted for the purpose of immediately entering into another practical arrangement." Something in his expression shifted, and he said very carefully, "Neither do I." Another silence in which the fire crackled and the horses moved in the darkness and the stars were overwhelming. "Last Saturday of the month," she said. "Yes. You will come to the door of Gerald Holt's dry goods store," she said. "You will behave properly." "I will," he said. "And you will not follow me along the main street before introducing yourself," she said. And there it was again, that smile, the slow one that came up from somewhere genuine and changed his whole face. "I think that lesson has been adequately learned," he said. She was smiling too, and this time she did not look away. She arrived in Creston the following morning to find it very much as Arthur had described it. A proper town on the rise, with a main street wide enough to be ambitious and buildings that suggested permanence rather than the provisional feel of many Western settlements. The dry goods store with Holt's General Supply painted above the door was midway down the main street, and when she pulled the wagon to a stop in front of it, the door opened almost immediately and Martha came out. Martha was 3 years older than Olive and had the same dark hair but a softer face, a face that had chosen accommodation where Olive's had chosen definition. She came down the steps with her arms already open and caught Olive in an embrace that was fierce and brief, and said everything. "You made it," Martha said, stepping back to look at her with searching eyes. "You look well, better than I expected." "I am well," Olive said. Martha looked past her to where Arthur had brought his buckskin horse to a stop a respectful distance down the street. Martha looked at him. She looked at Olive. She looked at him again. "And who is that?" she asked in a tone that had a great deal of sister in it. "A fellow traveler," Olive said. "He is a cowhand at the Calder ranch. He helped me on the road." "He is looking at you," Martha said with significant precision, in a way that suggests he hopes to be more than a fellow traveler. "Martha," Olive said. "I'm simply observing," Martha said placidly, and she went in to warn Gerald about the wagon that needed to be brought around back. Arthur rode forward and swung down from his horse, and he and Olive stood on the main street of Creston, Colorado Territory on a bright April morning, and they looked at each other with the full weight of everything that had happened over 3 days and 200 miles of western road. "You are safely arrived," he said. "I am," she said, "and thank you for all of it." He took his hat off, which she noticed, and said, "Last Saturday of the month." "I'll be here," she said. He put his hat back on, mounted his horse, and rode north out of Creston toward the Calder Ranch, and Olive watched him go until he was a small shape against the mountains, and then she went inside to meet her sister's life. The first weeks in Creston were busy enough to mostly occupy her. Gerald Holt was indeed not particularly memorable, but he was exactly as fair as Martha had promised, a quiet, organized man who ran his store with precision and had no objection whatsoever to a sister-in-law who could help with the accounts. Olive discovered a talent for the business side of the store that surprised both of them. She had always been good with numbers, but putting that ability to practical use in a commercial context was different from the household arithmetic of the homestead, and she found it genuinely engaging. Martha and Gerald had 2 children, both boys, aged 5 and 7, named James and Henry, who were small and loud and full of the kinetic chaos that small boys contain. Olive adjusted to them with the practical approach she brought to most things, establishing clear expectations that the boys responded to with reasonable willingness, apparently interpreting their aunt's directness as a welcome departure from adult behavior they considered overly negotiable. She found a room that suited her in the house, a small space off the back of the main floor with a window that faced the mountains, and she arranged her few things in it with the deliberate care of someone who intended to stay. She wrote to Arthur's mother in Missouri, which was perhaps a very strange thing to do, but which seemed necessary. She did not explain herself fully in the letter. She simply wrote that she was a friend of Arthur's from the road west, recently arrived in Creston, and that she hoped Mrs. Watkins would not think it too bold of her to write and say that her son was, by all indications, a person of unusual quality. The response came back 3 weeks later, a letter of 6 pages in the handwriting of a woman who clearly found the world endlessly interesting, and it was indeed, as Arthur had described, considerably more entertaining than anything Olive had witnessed in the corresponding period. Mrs. Watkins, whose first name was Eleanor, wrote about her school, her students, her neighbors' remarkable geraniums, a town meeting that had become unexpectedly contentious over the question of a new road, and in the final page about her son with a mother's exactness and love. That he was a good man, had always been a good man, that he did not say things he did not mean and did not mean things he did not say, and that whoever was asking about him, for whatever reason, should know that. Olive read this final page twice. The last Saturday of April arrived, and Arthur Watkins arrived with it. He came to the door of Holt's General Supply at 2 in the afternoon, clean-shaved and in clothes that were clearly his best, which were not dramatically different from his working clothes, but had been laundered and pressed with evident care. He had flowers. She had not expected the flowers, a bunch of spring wildflowers collected from the hillside clearly, purple and yellow and modest. Martha, who happened to be near the front of the store when he walked in, took one look at the flowers and turned to find something very urgent that needed attending to at the back of the store. Olive came out from behind the counter and he gave her the flowers and she accepted them, and there was a moment in which they simply looked at each other, and the accumulated weight of the 3 weeks since she had watched him ride north out of Creston was a palpable thing between them. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. The shaving was an improvement. He touched his jaw and had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I did rather let it go on the road." "I didn't mind it," she said, and then wished she had not said that quite so quickly. He was looking at her with a warmth that she was beginning to recognize as specifically his, a contained thing but unmistakable once you knew it was there. She took him to meet Martha formally, and then to meet Gerald, who shook his hand with the careful assessment of a man deciding whether his wife's sister was in good hands. Gerald Holt was not particularly memorable, but he had good instincts about people, and after a few minutes of conversation about the Calder Ranch and the cattle business and the general prospects of the region, he gave Arthur Watkins a nod that, if you were reading properly, meant approved. They walked out together in the afternoon, down the main street and then up to the small park at the edge of town where the view of the mountains was particularly good. They sat on a bench donated by the church congregation and they talked, and unlike the conversation of the road, which had been driven partly by the necessity of passing time, this conversation had the quality of deliberate choice. They were choosing to be there. They were choosing to talk to each other. That made it different. He told her about the first weeks at the ranch, about the stallion he was training, who was progressing well. He told her about Russ Calder, who was thawing toward Arthur's methods at approximately the speed of a glacier, but was definitely thawing. He told her about the bunkhouse and the other cowhands, two of whom were apparently engaged in a slow-burning rivalry over the right to complain about the cook's biscuits, which neither of them had the courage to raise directly with the cook. She told him about the store, about the accounts, about Gerald's organizational methods which were functional but could use a great deal of improvement. She told him about James and Henry and the ongoing negotiation of daily life with young children in a house. Told him with only slight hesitation about the letter from his mother. He stared at her. "You wrote to my mother." "I did." "Why?" "Because I wanted to know about you," she said, with the directness that was her particular gift and occasional problem, "and you were 40 miles away." He was quiet for a long moment, during which she wondered if she had miscalculated something important. But then he said, "What did she say?" "She said you are a good man who does not say things he does not mean." Another pause. "And what do you make of that?" "I make it consistent with my own observation," she said. He looked at her, and the afternoon light was doing the same thing to him that the evening light on the plains had done, finding the warm notes in his dark eyes and making him look like a man who was very nearly unable to contain what he was feeling. "Olive," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not moving too fast." "I didn't say you were." "I'm a man of deliberate habits," he said. "I know that too. But I find that my deliberate habits are all pointing in the same direction when it comes to you," he said, "and I think you should know that." She looked at the mountains for a moment, those extraordinary, permanent, patient mountains. "The last Saturday of each month is not very often," she said. "No," he agreed. "Gerald lets me take Thursday afternoons," she said. "There's a road north from town toward the ranch. I need the exercise." He was very still for a moment. Then, "The road north is quite scenic." "So I've heard," she said. He smiled, the slow, warm, real one, and reached over and took her hand where it lay on the bench between them, and held it with the careful certainty of someone who had thought about doing that for a long time and was finally doing it. She left her hand where it was. The summer of 1874 moved through Creston with the beauty and business of a frontier town coming into its own. Olive settled so thoroughly into the life of Holt's General Supply that by June Gerald had offered her a wage, saying that she was contributing considerably more than her keep, and that he did not run a charity, which was his uncomfortable way of being generous. She took Thursday afternoons for walking, and the road north was indeed scenic, and on roughly every other Thursday a man on a buckskin horse would come south along it, and they would meet somewhere between the ranch and the town, and walk together for a while before he turned back and she turned back and they went their separate ways. This arrangement was known to Martha, who said nothing about it directly but whose silence had a distinctly approving quality. It was known to Russ Calder, who had made a comment to Arthur about the wisdom of keeping a horse well rested for extra riding, which in the context of ranch life was a gracious thing to say. It was known to, Olive suspected, most of Creston, which was small enough that very little happened without general awareness. she found she did not particularly mind. What she felt for Arthur Watkins had grown from the initial electric something of those 3 days on the road into a settled and particular thing. It had weight to it now and texture. She knew him better. She knew about Aliner's letters and how his face looked when he read them, about the scar on his left forearm from a wire fence on the first drive up from Texas, about the fact that he could not drink more than 2 cups of coffee in a day without the sleep problem becoming worse. She knew that he was funnier than he appeared, with a dry wit that required attention to catch, and that she had come to love catching. She knew that he was capable of a silence that was as present and warm as conversation, which was a quality she valued enormously. She knew that he loved her. He had not said it in those words yet. But she knew it in the way that knowledge sometimes arrives ahead of its articulation, certain and clear. She knew that she loved him. She had told herself, several times through the spring and into the summer, that she was a widow of barely 4 months, and that things built in 3 days of road travel were not foundations, and that she was a sensible woman. And then she would see Arthur come down the northern road on his buckskin horse, easy in the saddle, looking for her, and the sensible woman would have to acknowledge that some things were what they were regardless of the timeline. It was on a Thursday in late June that he said it. They were sitting on a flat rock beside the small creek that ran about 2 miles north of Creston, the same creek she had started to use as the turning point of her walks, with their boots off and their feet in the cold mountain-fed water, which was a thing that would have seemed wildly improper in Ohio, and seemed entirely natural out here where the mountain water was very cold, and the afternoon was very warm, and there was no one for miles in any direction. He was talking about Duchess, the mare at the ranch, about a breakthrough he had had with her that week that meant something significant in terms of her training. Olive was listening with her eyes half closed and her face tipped up toward the sun. There was a fish visible in the clear water, hovering in place against the current. "I love you," Arthur said. He said it the way he said most important things, without preamble and without performance, simply as a fact that had become undeniable enough to speak. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was looking at the water, slightly sideways to her, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was being very deliberate, and his hands were resting on his knees perfectly still. "Arthur," she said. He looked at her then. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time." The thing that happened to his face then was something she kept for a long time after, the way relief and joy and something that had been held very carefully finally allowed to breathe can move across a person's face all at once. He reached over and took her hand, the same careful certain way he always did, and she turned her hand under his and held on. "I don't have anything to offer you yet," he said. "I have a cowhand's wages and a position that isn't fully secured. I don't have land or a house." "I didn't ask you for those things," she said. "I know," he said, "but I want you to know that I intend to. I intend to build something proper, something that deserves you." She looked at him for a long time, this man who had followed her for 20 miles before she asked his name, who carried spare wagon spokes for strangers, who wrote to his mother every month and slept lightly from an old sense of responsibility and trained horses with patience and respect, who loved her. "You already have everything that matters," she said, meaning it entirely. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the first time he had done that, and she felt it all the way through her like the crack of the broken spoke, something giving way that had been holding too long, but this time breaking open into something better. They were engaged before the summer ended. He came to Creston on the last Saturday of August and spoke to Gerald first, which was the proper thing to do since Martha was the closest family Olive had available. And Gerald, who had indeed concluded that Arthur Watkins was a man worth trusting with his wife's sister, gave his approval with the same awkward generosity he brought to most personal matters. He proposed in the park at the edge of town, the same bench where they had first held hands, on a warm August evening with the mountains turning pink and gold in the sunset light. He did not have a ring. He had not been able to afford a ring yet, and he told her so directly, without embarrassment, and offered her instead a small carved horse he had made himself from a piece of pine wood, a simple thing but careful and unmistakable, the lines of it clearly a horse in motion, and it was one of the best things anyone had ever given her. She said yes before he had fully finished the question. He had a ring by October, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had saved for specifically, bought from a jeweler in Denver on his day off. And when he put it on her finger at the kitchen table of Holt's house on a Thursday afternoon, while Martha made unnecessary noise in the other room, Olive looked at it and then at him, and felt the particular fullness of a moment that is exactly what it is supposed to be. They married in December of 1874 in the little church in Creston, in a ceremony attended by Martha and Gerald and the boys, and a selection of the town that had, over the course of 8 months, watched this particular story unfold with the interested attention of a community that appreciated a good romance. Russ Calder came, which surprised Arthur considerably and moved him in a way he did not fully articulate. Eleanor Watkins, Arthur's mother, made the long journey from Missouri by train and stage, arriving 3 days before the wedding, a small, energetic woman with silver-streaked hair and very bright eyes who embraced Olive when they met with the unceremonious warmth of someone who had already decided they were family. "You wrote me a very good letter," Eleanor said. "You wrote back 6 pages, Olive said. Eleanor laughed. "I like you very much already," she said. The ceremony was simple and true. The minister read the words. They said the words that needed to be said, and Arthur Watkins put his hand over his heart and looked at Olive Turner as she became Olive Watkins, and he looked at her the way the mountains looked at the plain, steady, enormous, permanent. She looked back at him the same way. The first year of their marriage was built on 2 incomes and considerable practical intelligence. Olive continued at the store. Arthur's position at the Calder Ranch had in the fall been formalized. Russ Calder's horse trainer had retired in October, and Russ had offered Arthur the position, at a higher wage and with a small house on the ranch property that went with it. A real house, modest but solid, with 2 rooms and a stove and a window that faced the mountains. They moved into it in January of 1875. Olive's things from Martha's house and Arthur's, few possessions from the bunkhouse combined into something that was, between them, enough to make a home. Olive hung her mother's green wool coat on the peg by the door and put the carved wooden horse on the mantel above the stove, and the house became theirs. She quit the store gradually, moving to part-time through the spring, because the ranch was far enough from town that the daily trip was impractical. But Gerald found a reliable solution. Olive took over the accounts entirely, working from home and riding into town once a week to go over the figures with Gerald directly. It was an arrangement that suited everyone, and it gave her time for the garden she put in behind the house in the spring, a serious and ambitious garden that the mountain soil was more receptive to than she had expected. Arthur broke horses and trained them with the patience that had always been his gift. He had 3 ranchers from neighboring properties sending horses to him by summer, on Russ Calder's recommendation, and the income from the additional work built quietly and steadily towards something larger. In the evenings they sat together in the house with the lamp between them and read, or talked, or did the particular comfortable quiet thing that 2 people do when they have found the person with whom silence is its own form of conversation. Arthur wrote to Eleanor every month, and now Olive added her own page to the letter, and Eleanor's 6-page responses became something they read aloud to each other at the kitchen table over coffee, which was one of Olive's favorite things about any given month. In the autumn of 1875, Olive told Arthur that they were expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her and put his arms around her from behind where she sat, his face pressed to the top of her head, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed to be said. Their son, William Thomas Watkins, was born in June of 1876, attended by the doctor from Creston and by Martha, who had driven out to the ranch and stayed for a week because Olive needed her there, and because Martha was the kind of woman who went where she was needed without being asked twice. Arthur, in the tradition of Western ranch life, was not present for the birth itself, but he had the entire ranch's sympathy throughout the long day, and Russ Calder, who had 5 children of his own, kept him occupied with invented tasks and occasional cups of terrible coffee, until the moment the doctor opened the door of the house and said that everything was well. Arthur walked into the room where Olive lay tired and brilliant with the newborn boy in her arms, and he looked at them both with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, something so open and undefended that it was almost unbearable in its honesty. He sat down beside her on the bed and looked at his son's face, red and crumpled and perfect, and his eyes were bright with something that he did not try to hide. "William," Olive said, "after your father." He looked at her. "You remembered. You mentioned his name once," she said. "In passing, you said it so quietly that I thought you might not have meant me to hear it." He took her free hand and held it, and she understood that the holding was the answer. Alina came in November to meet her grandson, and she and William regarded each other with the mutual serious attention of very old wisdom and very new life. Alina held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had taught many small children many things, and understood that babies were simply people with more immediate concerns. She stayed for a month, sleeping in the second room of the small house that they had begun to think about expanding, and her presence was a gift that none of them commented on directly but all of them felt. When she left, Olive walked her to the stage that would start her back toward Missouri, and they embraced in the cold December air. "Take care of him," Alina said, meaning Arthur. "Always," Olive said. "And let him take care of you," Alina added, with the precision of a woman who had watched her son's particular way of loving and wanted to make sure it was received. "He needs to do that as much as you need anything." Olive thought about this on the ride back to the ranch, the mountains white-capped and brilliant in the December cold, the air so clear it felt like looking through glass. She thought about a man who had followed her wagon for 20 miles before she asked his name. She thought about a spare spoke in a saddlebag, about coffee made before she woke, about a man standing in the rain keeping watch because it was the right thing to do, about slow smiles and carved wooden horses and hands held on benches and the way her name sounded when he said it, like a word he had decided to keep. She let him take care of her. She understood now what Alina meant. Not dependency, not diminishment, but the recognition that love expressed itself in care, and to receive care well was itself a kind of love. The house expanded in the spring of 1877. Arthur and 2 ranch hands added 2 more rooms over the course of a month, working on weekends and evenings, and the house that had been a modest 2 rooms became a proper 4-room dwelling with a proper bedroom, and a proper room for William and space for the things that a growing family accumulates. Arthur built a cradle without being asked, which Olive discovered one evening when she went to check on William, and found it standing in the corner of his room, already sanded smooth and finished. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. "I built it for when the next one comes," Arthur said from behind her, with the easy certainty of a man who has decided something. "Have we discussed a next one?" she asked. "I'm discussing it now," he said, and she could hear the smile. She turned around and looked at him in the lamplight, this man she had been married to for 2 years and known for 3, who still made her heart do something complicated when he smiled. "Then yes," she said, "we are discussing it." The next one came in the spring of 1878. Another boy, which Arthur received with the delighted and slightly helpless joy of a man who is apparently very good at producing sons. They named him Daniel James, the James for Martha's oldest, who was William's favorite cousin and a boy of considerable personality. James and Henry Holt had by 1878 become firm fixtures of Arthur and Olive's lives, spending summers partly at the ranch, where they were learning to ride with the absorbed seriousness of boys, who had decided that horses were the most important thing in the world, which in this particular household was an attitude that found considerable support. Olive's garden in the summer of 1878 was a thing of genuine achievement, a full kitchen garden that produced enough through the growing season to put up preserves through the fall and keep the household well supplied through the winter months. She had developed opinions about Colorado soil and what it would support, and she shared these opinions with the other women on neighboring ranches with the forthright generosity of someone who found useful knowledge too valuable to hoard. There was a small community of ranch families within a reasonable distance of the Calder spread, and Olive had become, in the way that capable and direct women sometimes do in frontier communities, a kind of anchor point for the women of that community. She organized the informal borrowing and lending network that got families through hard patches. She was the person people came to when they needed help reading a contract or a piece of official correspondence, because she had a clear mind for language and law. She was not soft, but she was good, and people understood the difference. She thought occasionally about the injustice of her position as a woman in this time and this place, the reality that a woman's property became her husband's at marriage, that her choices were so much narrower than a man's in every legal and economic sense, that the work she did at the store and in the garden and in the community had no formal recognition and no formal protection. She thought about Edmund's land going to the bank while she had no claim to fight it. She thought about what it meant to be, legally, a dependent rather than a person. She thought about all of this with the clear and unsentimental eye she brought to things that were wrong and real. She talked about it with Arthur, who listened with the same attention he gave to everything she said, and who agreed with her in the direct way he agreed with things, without qualification. "It isn't right," he said simply. "No," she said. "It isn't. I'd not take anything from you," he said. "Everything we have is ours equally." "I know that," she said. "But knowing what you would do and having it protected by law are different things." He looked at her steadily. "Then let's make sure what we build is strong enough to make the law irrelevant." It was, she thought, exactly the response of a man who did not say things he did not mean. They built. Through the late 1870s, the horse training operation grew into something beyond the Calder ranch's own needs. Arthur had a reputation now that reached beyond their county, and ranchers from 2 territories over sent horses to him for training, some of them traveling considerable distances because the results were worth it. A horse trained by Arthur Watkins was different, people said, in the way a person trained by a teacher who genuinely cared was different from one drilled by rote, more present, more willing, more fully itself. In 1879, Russ Calder, who was getting older and whose oldest son was not interested in the ranching life, made Arthur a proposition. A parcel of land at the edge of the Calder property, 40 acres with good water and good grass, could be purchased on terms that Russ made deliberately fair, because Russ Calder was a man who understood that keeping good people meant treating them well. Arthur and Olive sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the sound of William and Daniel asleep in the other room, and they went over the figures with the careful attention of 2 people who had been building towards something and were now looking at it. "We can do this," Olive said. "We can do this," Arthur agreed. They signed the papers in the spring of 1880, and Olive Turner Watkins, who had left a mortgaged homestead in Kansas 6 years prior with nothing but a wagon and a determination and a letter from her sister, stood on 40 acres of Colorado Territory land that was hers and looked at the mountains and breathed. The house they built on those 40 acres took 2 years to complete fully, done mostly by Arthur himself with help from the ranch hands during slower seasons, and it was a proper house, a house with 5 rooms and a wide front porch, and a kitchen with a proper stove and windows in every room that caught the mountain light. The garden was 3 times the size of the one at the old ranch house. There was a stable for the training horses, built first because it was the engine of everything. William, at 6, was already spending every possible moment around the horses, with the same absorbed devotion that his father had. He was a quiet, observant child who communicated largely through actions, and who had inherited his mother's directness in a form that was somehow both unsettling and endearing. Daniel, at 4, was his precise opposite: loud, enthusiastic, constantly in motion, in possession of opinions about everything and unwilling to keep any of them to himself. He had Eleanor's quality of finding the world endlessly interesting, which meant he required more attention, but was also, Olive thought, the better companion. They celebrated the completion of the house with Martha and Gerald and the boys and Russ Calder and his wife and Eleanor, who made the trip once more from Missouri for the occasion, and who walked through every room of the house with the particular silence of someone who is feeling a great deal. At the end of the walk she stood in the kitchen and looked at Olive, and there was something in her eyes that needed no translation. "He's happy," Eleanor said softly. "He's more himself than I've ever seen him." "He is," Olive agreed. "That's you," Eleanor said. Olive considered this. "No," she said gently, "that's us. That's what this is." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled, and the smile was Arthur's smile, the slow, warm, real one. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." That evening, after the guests had gone and the boys were in bed and the house was quiet with the particular quality of a new home settling into itself, Olive and Arthur stood on the front porch in the cool September air and looked at the mountains in the darkness, barely visible but present, enormous and patient. He had his arm around her, and she was leaning into him. And they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together over 6 years of building a life in rooms and on roads and beside fires. "You know," she said after a while, "you were very strange that first day, following my wagon without introducing yourself." "I know," he said. "I've thought about why I did that. And I think," he said carefully, "that I knew, some part of me knew, that if I rode up that first morning and said, 'Hello, I'm Arthur Watkins and I'd like to ride along,' you would have said, 'Thank you, I'm fine,' very politely, and driven on, and I would have let you because that's the correct thing to do." "And I wasn't ready to be correct about it." She thought about that. "You weren't ready to lose the possibility." "No," he said, "I wasn't." She turned to look at him, this man on whom the years had settled well, who wore the rancher's life and the trainer's patience and the husband's devotion and the father's joy all at once and made them look like one coherent thing. "20 miles, she said. "You followed me for 20 miles. "Yes," he said, "and I made you wait all of them before I asked your name." "You had a broken spoke," he said. "You needed to see if I was useful before you wasted a question on me." She laughed, the real one, the warm, unguarded one that he had told her she should produce more often 6 years ago on the open plains. "That is an extremely flattering interpretation of my behavior." "I've always found you admirable," he said, "even when you're being pointed." "Especially then," she said. "Especially then," he agreed, and he pulled her closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder and looked at the dark mountains and felt, with the certainty of something long tested and now fully known, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In the spring of 1882 they had a daughter, their third and last child. They named her Eleanor Me Watkins, and Arthur received the news that it was a girl with the same delighted helplessness he had brought to both his sons, which suggested that he had no strong preference in the matter and simply loved whoever arrived. Eleanor Me, from the beginning, was a child of considerable force of personality, which was noted by her grandmother, who made the journey from Missouri one final time to meet her namesake, and who held the infant with great satisfaction and said, "She looks annoyed," which was true, and which all present considered a promising sign. Young Eleanor Me grew up in the house on the 40 acres with the mountain view and the large garden and the stable full of horses, with 2 older brothers who would do anything she asked, and a father who taught her to ride at 3, and a mother who taught her to read at 4, and to understand accounts by the time she started school. She had her father's patience and her mother's directness and her grandmother Eleanor's gift for finding the world interesting, and she was, In short, a person to be reckoned with from the very beginning. The 1880s moved through the ranch with the rhythm of seasons and work, and the accumulating good weight of a life genuinely lived. Arthur's training operation continued to grow its reputation. Olive continued the accounts for Gerald, who had expanded the store and who was now, in Olive's firm opinion, adequately memorable. William discovered at 12 that he had his father's gift with horses and his mother's gift with language, which turned out to be an unexpectedly useful combination. And Daniel discovered at 10 that he was interested in building things, a talent that manifested itself in the increasingly sophisticated structures he constructed for purposes that were not always immediately clear, but were always structurally sound. Martha and Gerald prospered. The town of Creston prospered. The mountains remained, as mountains do, exactly as they had always been, permanent and enormous and patient, watching everything with equanimity. Arthur's mother Eleanor died in the winter of 1885, peacefully in her house in Missouri, surrounded by people who loved her. She had written to Olive right up to the end, the last letter arriving 2 weeks after she passed, written in the strong, clear hand that had never diminished. 6 pages about the school, her students, the geraniums, and in the final page, a note that said only, "Thank you for what you gave him and what you gave me. I knew you both were right for each other the moment I read your first letter. Love has very good handwriting." Olive kept that letter in the drawer of the desk in the house, the one she used for the accounts, and she took it out sometimes and read it, and felt the presence of the woman who had written it, small and energetic and bright with that particular light. She told Arthur what his mother had written, reading the final page aloud to him at the kitchen table one winter evening, with the lamp between them and the sound of the children doing various things in the other rooms. He listened with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on the middle distance, and when she finished there was a long quiet. "She always saw things clearly," he said finally. "She did," Olive agreed. He looked at her, and the years were in his face now, not as diminishment but as something richly accumulated, evidence of a life taken seriously and lived with full attention. "She was right about the handwriting," he said. Olive smiled. "Your letters to her were terrible." "My letters to you were better," he said. "Considerably," she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same careful, certain way he always had, the first habit of love that he had never given up, and she turned her hand under his and held on. Outside the kitchen window the mountains were invisible in the winter dark, but she could feel them there, as she always could, those permanent, enormous, patient things, which had been watching over this particular valley since long before any of them arrived and would be watching long after, and which seemed, in the way of mountains, to approve of what was happening at the kitchen table of the house at the edge of 40 Colorado acres, where a man who had once followed a wagon for 20 miles was holding the hand of the woman he had been moving toward all his life. William was 17 when he began to show his father's gift at horse training in ways that went beyond childhood aptitude and entered the territory of genuine ability. Arthur worked alongside him in the mornings with the particular satisfaction of a man teaching his child a thing he loves, and Olive, watching them from the porch, thought that this was one of the best things she had ever seen, this father and son moving around the training corral in the early Colorado light with the horses moving around them, all of it precise and patient and full of the quiet language that existed between people who understood the same thing deeply. By 1887, the Watkins training ranch, as it had come to be known, had a reputation that extended well into the territories and brought riders from considerable distances. Arthur had written down his methods in a series of notebooks over the years, partly for his own reference, and partly because Olive had suggested, with the directness she brought to good ideas, that the world had a right to know what he knew. The notebooks were eventually, after much persuasion and a contribution of considerable editorial energy from Olive, sent to a man in Denver who published agricultural and ranching materials. He recognized immediately what he was looking at, printed them as a small volume, and sent Arthur 20 copies and a check that represented more money than any one check had previously represented in their household. Arthur held the check and looked at it for a long time and then at Olive. "You made me do that," he said. "You made you do that," she said. "I merely pointed out that it should exist." "The pointing out was the important part," he said. "It usually is," she agreed. Daniel, at 15, had by this time constructed a remarkably complex system of channels and gates in the garden that managed the water with an efficiency that impressed even the neighboring ranchers who came to see it. He was going to build things, it was clear, things larger and more permanent than channels and gates, though no one knew yet exactly what they would be. He had that quality of boys who are moving towards something that has not yet come into focus, and Olive watched him with the patient certainty of a mother who knows that the focus will arrive in its own time. Eleanor Me at 5 was already the boss of the corral in ways that both her brothers found both exasperating and entirely inevitable. She had her father's steadiness with horses and her mother's absolute refusal to accept a situation she considered suboptimal, and she approached life with the energy of someone who has a great deal to accomplish and intends to waste none of the available time. Arthur and Olive, watching their children from the front porch of the house on a summer evening in 1887, with the mountains golden in the late light and the smell of Olive's garden rich on the warm air and the sounds of their children doing the various vigorous things children do, existed in that moment in the fullness of what they had built, which was considerable. It was nothing as remarkable as it might have been to someone watching from the outside. A ranch, a house, a family, an ordinary Western life. But what it contained, what they had put into it over 13 years of choosing each other and their children and their work every single day, was not ordinary at all. It was the specific and particular thing that happens when two people find each other and decide to mean it. He had followed her for 20 miles before she stopped and asked his name. She had been going toward her sister, and he had been going toward his horses, and the same road had taken them both west, and one of them had understood before the other that the road was not the point, that they were the point, and he had been patient enough to stay close while she worked it out. They were, in 1887, and in every year before and every year that would come after, the point. Olive Turner Watkins, who had been a widow with a wagon and a broken spoke and a sensible plan, and Arthur Watkins, who had been a cowhand with a spare spoke and a decision he could not fully explain, had made a life of the real and lasting kind, the kind that is built slowly from honest things and held together by the daily choice of love, which is never the dramatic thing and always the enormous one. And on summer evenings, when the mountains turned gold and the garden breathed its warm green breath and the children's voices carried across the yard, they sat on the front porch of their house and held hands and were quiet together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything, accumulated slowly and deliberately, the way all the best things are, and it was theirs.